in the shadow of the Bighorn Mountains, where ancient spirits dance with morning mist and the wind carries stories older than written history, there lived a man who had never known defeat in battle, but had never known peace in his heart. Every dawn, Marcus Thunderheart would rise to patrol the sacred boundaries of the Crow Reservation, protecting land that held the bones of his ancestors and the dreams of his people's future. What he never expected was the morning a stranger would cross those boundaries, carrying nothing but a worn leather briefcase and eyes that could see through the armor he'd built around his soul over 15 years of fighting for what remained of his world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm on Marcus Thunderheart's phone never had a chance to sound. His eyes opened at 4:43 a.m., same as they had every morning for the past 7 years, 3 minutes before the digital chirp would disturb the silence of his modest home on the edge of the Little Bighorn River. His calloused hands, scarred from countless confrontations with trespassers and treaty violators, found the edge of the wool blanket his grandmother had woven decades ago. Back when the reservation felt like a place of possibility rather than a fortress under constant siege, the floorboards of his small house knew his weight, knew exactly where to creak and where to hold their silence as he moved through the pre-dawn darkness. Everything in the two-bedroom home had its place, its purpose, its distance from the chaos that existed beyond the boundaries he spent his life defending. The coffee maker sat precisely 12 inches from the sink. His boots waited by the back door, laces loose enough for quick entry, but tight enough to last a 16-hour day of patrol duty. His tactical vest hung on a wooden peg next to a stack of legal documents that had grown thick with years of land disputes, water rights violations, and federal court filings. Outside, the Montana sky stretched endless and dark, punctured only by stars that seemed close enough to touch in the thin reservation air. The thermometer on his porch read 34 degrees, cold enough to make breath visible, but warm enough for the kind of work that would fill his day. Marcus poured his coffee black, strong as his grandmother's medicine tea, and stepped onto the porch that faced east toward the Little Bighorn battlefield, where his great-great-grandfather had fought alongside Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull in when the last great victory of the Plains tribes. The reservation spread out before him in the dim light, 2.3 million acres of rolling prairie, mountain foothills, and river bottom that the U.S. government had designated as the permanent home of the Crow Nation. In 1868, back then, it had been called the Crow Indian Reservation, a name that reflected federal ownership more than tribal sovereignty. Now it was officially the Crow Reservation, controlled and governed by the Crow tribe. But the change in name hadn't eliminated the constant pressure from outside interests, who viewed the land as an obstacle to resource extraction and economic development. Marcus stood 6 feet 7 inches in his stocking feet, shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of tribal expectations, and hands large enough to palm a basketball, but gentle enough to braid his daughter's hair before school. His long black hair, kept in traditional braids when he was on official business, hung loose this morning around shoulders that had carried the burden of protecting tribal sovereignty since he was 25 years old. His eyes, the color of flint striking steel, held a steadiness that came from years of looking at horizons and seeing threats that needed addressing. As the Crow Nation's Director of Land Protection Services, a position he had created for himself when the Tribal Council proved too slow to respond to increasing encroachment, Marcus had developed a reputation that extended far beyond reservation boundaries. Energy companies knew his name. Federal agents respected his knowledge of treaty law. Environmental groups sought his cooperation for projects that aligned with tribal interests. But more importantly, the people who tried to steal water, graze cattle illegally, or conduct unauthorized surveys on tribal land had learned to recognize his truck from miles away and make other plans for their day. The patrol vehicle, a modified 2019 Ford F-250 with reinforced bumpers and communication equipment that could reach tribal headquarters. The FBI and the federal courthouse in Billings sat loaded with the day's supplies. Legal documents sorted into waterproof cases, surveying equipment for documenting violations, cameras capable of evidence-quality photography, and tools for removing unauthorized installations from tribal property. The truck bed held the accumulated evidence of a man who documented everything and trusted nothing that wasn't verified by multiple sources. Property stakes driven illegally onto tribal land, sections of fence built without permission, and gate hardware removed from locations where outsiders had tried to block tribal access to traditional hunting and gathering areas. The morning routine never varied. Coffee on the porch until the horizon began to separate itself from the sky. Walk the perimeter of his own property, checking for signs that someone had tried to gather intelligence about his personal security measures. Feed the horses that grazed in the pasture behind his house, 3/4 horses bred from bloodlines that had carried Crow warriors across these same plains for generations. Check the trail cameras positioned at strategic points around his land. Reviewing footage that might reveal surveillance attempts or trespassing incidents. By 6:15, the sun had pulled itself above the eastern ridge, painting the reservation in shades of gold and amber that photographers traveled thousands of miles to capture, but that Marcus saw as the beginning of another day's battle to protect what remained of his people's ancestral territory. He loaded his equipment and headed for the northern boundary, where intelligence from tribal rangers suggested that Yellowstone Energy Corporation had been conducting unauthorized geological surveys in preparation for a fracking operation that would violate both federal treaty obligations and tribal water rights. The drive took 25 minutes across terrain that would challenge most vehicles. But his truck knew every washout, every cattle guard, every place where spring runoff had carved new channels, across dirt roads that existed only because previous generations of Crow tribal members had driven the same routes often enough to create permanent tracks. The boundary marker stood at the edge of what locals called Eagle's Rest Canyon, a steep-sided ravine that cut through the reservation like a wound that had never properly healed. The creek at the bottom ran clear and cold, fed by springs that had sustained Crow encampments for countless generations, long before European diseases and cavalry charges had forced the surviving population onto government-designated reservations. Ancient cottonwoods grew along the water's edge, their leaves whispering stories in the old language that Marcus's grandmother had taught him but that fewer young people bothered to learn each year. The trees had witnessed buffalo herds that darkened the prairie like storms, had sheltered warriors preparing for battles that would determine whether the Crow Nation would survive as a sovereign people or disappear into the assimilated obscurity that had consumed so many other tribes. Marcus parked the truck and surveyed the area with eyes trained to notice disturbances that others would miss. Fresh tire tracks crossed tribal land from the direction of the county road, ending at a location where someone had set up equipment for what appeared to be seismic testing. Stakes marked a grid pattern that extended deep into the canyon, where underground explosions would reveal geological structures that energy companies could exploit for fossil fuel extraction. The equipment was expensive and sophisticated, suggesting corporate backing rather than individual trespassing. Seismic sensors positioned with precision that indicated professional geological survey work. Generator units capable of powering electronic equipment for extended periods. And most importantly, no permits, no tribal authorization, and no evidence that anyone had bothered to consult with the Crow Nation before beginning operations that could contaminate the watershed that supplied drinking water to 3 reservation communities. Marcus began with documentation, photographing every piece of equipment from multiple angles, recording GPS coordinates that would support federal court proceedings, and collecting physical evidence that could prove unauthorized use of tribal property. His methodology was systematic and thorough, developed through years of building legal cases that would survive challenges from corporate attorneys and federal bureaucrats who specialized in finding technical loopholes that could invalidate tribal sovereignty claims. The work was honest in a way that few occupations remained. Document the violation, gather the evidence, build the case, present it to authorities who had legal obligations to enforce treaty rights. The system would either protect tribal sovereignty or reveal itself as inadequate for the purpose Congress had claimed when it passed legislation promising federal protection for tribal interests. There was no middle ground in land protection work, no partial success that would satisfy either energy corporations seeking maximum resource extraction or tribal members who had already lost too much ancestral territory to compromise any further. The boundaries would either hold against outside pressure or they would be erased by economic interests that viewed tribal land as an untapped resource rather than the foundation of cultural survival. By 930, the first phase of documentation was complete. Marcus had cataloged 17 separate violations of federal treaty law, tribal sovereignty, and environmental protection regulations that applied specifically to Indian country. The evidence was strong enough to shut down the operation immediately and impose substantial penalties on Yellowstone Energy Corporation for conducting unauthorized activities on tribal property, but experience had taught him that documentation was only the first step in a process that could take years to resolve and might ultimately depend more on political pressure than legal precedent. Energy companies employed teams of attorneys whose job was to delay enforcement long enough for ore extraction operations to become economically entrenched and politically difficult to reverse. The canyon echoed with sounds that belonged to the ancient world rather than the modern one. Water flowing over stones that had been shaped by countless floods, wind moving through branches that had sheltered Crow ancestors for generations, and the distant call of an eagle hunting in the thermal currents that rose from the valley floor. Marcus paused in his evidence, gathering to listen to the silence that existed between human-generated sounds, the deep quiet that his grandmother had taught him to recognize as the voice of the land itself. The creek, the trees, and the canyon walls had witnessed the entire history of his people's relationship with this place. From the time when they followed buffalo herds across unbroken prairie to the current era when they fought federal court battles to prevent the last fragments of their ancestral territory from being destroyed by industrial development. The seismic equipment represented more than unauthorized trespassing. It symbolized the ongoing assault on tribal sovereignty that had taken different forms over the past century and a half, but had never completely ended. Military conquest had been followed by cultural assimilation programs, which had been replaced by economic pressure that achieved the same result through different methods. Energy corporations didn't need cavalry charges to seize tribal land. They simply needed to make resource extraction more profitable than traditional uses of the territory, then apply enough political and economic pressure to force tribal governments to accept development agreements that would transform ancestral homelands into industrial sacrifice zones. Marcus loaded the evidence containers into his truck and prepared to drive to the next location where tribal rangers had reported suspicious activity. The morning's work had provided enough documentation to support federal enforcement action, but he knew from experience that legal victories often came too late to prevent the damage that unauthorized operations could inflict while court proceedings dragged through bureaucratic delays. The battle for tribal sovereignty was fought one boundary marker at a time, one trespassing incident at a time, one federal court filing at a time. Victory required constant vigilance, perfect documentation, and the kind of sustained commitment that could consume entire lifetimes without ever achieving final resolution. But the alternative was surrender, and Marcus Thunderheart had been raised by people who had chosen death over surrender when the cavalry came to force them onto reservations. His grandmother had taught him that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. and that the land was one of those things because it contained the bones of the ancestors and the hopes of generations yet to be born. Truck climbed out of the canyon toward the next patrol area, carrying evidence that would either protect tribal sovereignty or document its violation for future generations who would inherit whatever remained of their ancestral territory. The morning sun climbed higher into a sky that belonged to no government and recognized no boundaries, except those that the Creator had, written in the movement of seasons and the flow of rivers toward the sea, preparing and narrating this story. Took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The second patrol location lay 15 miles southeast, where Crow Creek carved a meandering path through traditional gathering grounds that had provided medicinal plants and ceremonial materials for tribal healers since before written records began. Marcus had received reports of unauthorized botanical sampling in the area, which suggested either academic researchers operating without tribal permits or pharmaceutical companies conducting preliminary surveys for commercially valuable plant compounds. Both possibilities represented serious violations of tribal sovereignty and federal law protecting indigenous knowledge, but pharmaceutical theft was particularly dangerous because it could lead to corporate patents on traditional medicines that tribal healers had used for centuries. Companies had attempted such biopiracy before, claiming legal ownership of plant-based compounds that indigenous peoples had discovered, refined, and preserved through oral tradition long before European contact. The drive to Crow Creek took him through the heart of the reservation, past the tribal college where his younger sister taught environmental science to students who would inherit the responsibility for protecting what remained of their ancestral territory, past the community health center where his ex-wife worked as a nurse, serving tribal members who often couldn't afford medical care in the border towns, where racism and indifference made treatment uncertain at best, past the ceremonial grounds where his grandmother had taught him the old stories, the ones that explained why certain places were sacred and why some knowledge was too dangerous to share with outsiders, who viewed the natural world as a collection of resources to be harvested rather than a living system that required respectful reciprocity. Marcus had grown up bilingual, speaking Crow at home and English at the federal school where teachers had tried to eliminate indigenous languages and cultural practices through systematic punishment and forced assimilation. He had learned to navigate both worlds, but had never felt completely comfortable in either one. Too traditional for many of his urban-educated contemporaries, too modern for some of the elders who remembered when the reservation was more isolated from outside influences. His position as Director of Land Protection Services had been controversial. When he created it 7 years ago, some tribal council members had argued that his aggressive approach to boundary enforcement would provoke retaliation from federal agencies and corporate interests who preferred to deal with more accommodating tribal representatives. Others had questioned whether someone with his military background and confrontational reputation was the right person to handle delicate negotiations about treaty rights and sovereignty issues, but Marcus had proven that systematic documentation and aggressive legal action could protect tribal interests more effectively than diplomatic accommodation had achieved in previous decades. His success rate in federal court was higher than that of most experienced attorneys, and his reputation for thorough preparation and relentless follow-through had made potential trespassers think twice before conducting unauthorized activities on tribal land. The creek bottom came into view as he crested a low hill dotted with traditional shelters that tribal members still used during hunting season and spiritual retreats. The area looked undisturbed from a distance, but Marcus had learned to notice signs that others would miss: tire tracks that didn't match tribal vehicles, disturbed vegetation around plants that had medicinal value, and the subtle reorganization of natural materials that indicated human presence in places where few people had legitimate reasons to visit. He parked the truck in a grove of cottonwoods, That would provide concealment while he conducted preliminary reconnaissance. The botanical sampling, if it was occurring, would probably take place near the creek where rare plants grew in soil enriched by centuries of seasonal flooding. Corporate researchers typically focused on species that existed in limited geographic ranges, since rarity increased the likelihood that their compounds hadn't been previously documented in scientific literature. Marcus moved through the timber with skills learned during 2 tours as an Army Ranger in Afghanistan, where patrol work had meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. He knew how to read terrain for tactical advantages, how to move quietly through natural environments, and how to observe without being observed by people who might be conducting activities they didn't want witnessed. The first sign of unauthorized presence was a sampling container partially concealed beneath brush near a patch of rare medicinal plants that tribal healers gathered for specific ceremonial purposes. The container was labeled with corporate markings that identified it as property of Biodyne Research Corporation, a pharmaceutical company based in Denver that specialized in developing commercial applications for compounds found in wild plant species. Marcus photographed the container and its location, then began a systematic search of the surrounding area that revealed additional evidence of extensive sampling activities. Plant specimens had been collected from dozens of locations, with particular attention to species that existed nowhere else in the region and had been used by tribal healers for generations to treat conditions that modern medicine struggled to address effectively. The sampling had been conducted with professional competence that suggested advanced knowledge of both botany and traditional tribal medicine. Whoever had gathered the specimens understood which plants had medicinal properties and where they could be found during specific seasons. Such knowledge typically required years of study with tribal healers, who were extremely selective about sharing information that had been preserved through careful oral tradition. Marcus was photographing the most recent sampling site when he heard movement in the brush approximately 50 yards downstream. Not the random sounds of wildlife, but the deliberate footsteps of someone trying to move quietly through terrain they didn't know well enough to avoid, obstacles that would announce their presence to anyone listening carefully. He positioned himself behind a large cottonwood and waited for whoever was approaching to reveal themselves. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the sounds of someone pushing through vegetation that offered more resistance than they had anticipated. Then he saw her, a woman in her early 30s with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing field clothes that showed evidence of several days in rough country. She carried a leather satchel that appeared to contain collecting equipment and notebooks, moving with the careful attention of someone who was looking for specific plants, rather than simply hiking through natural areas. Her approach to the creek was purposeful and knowledgeable, suggesting familiarity with the locations where rare medicinal species could be found. Marcus stepped out from behind the cottonwood before she could begin additional collecting activities. "You're on tribal land," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Unauthorized botanical research is a federal offense." The woman stopped immediately, her hands visible and non-threatening, but her expression showed more surprise than fear. She was tall, maybe 5'8", with the kind of lean build that came from extensive fieldwork rather than recreational hiking. Her eyes were the color of sage after rain, direct and intelligent, holding his gaze without the defensiveness that most trespassers displayed when confronted. "I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell," she said, setting down her satchel and reaching slowly into her jacket pocket. "I have documentation for this research project." She withdrew a folder containing official-looking permits and academic credentials, offering them for his inspection without making sudden movements that might escalate the confrontation. Marcus examined the documents carefully, noting inconsistencies that his experience had taught him to recognize. The permits were technically valid, but had been issued by federal agencies without tribal consultation, violating government-to-government protocols that required indigenous consent for research activities on reservation land. The academic credentials identified her as an ethnobotanist from the University of Colorado, but didn't explain why she was collecting specimens without tribal oversight. Federal permits don't authorize research on sovereign tribal territory, Marcus said, returning the documents. You need tribal approval, which requires consultation with traditional healers and cultural preservation committees. Did you request permission from the Crow Nation? Sarah's expression shifted as she recognized the legal complexity of her situation. Her research permits were legitimate within federal jurisdiction, but tribal sovereignty created additional layers of authority that many academic researchers didn't understand or chose to ignore. My department was told that federal permits would be sufficient for this project, she said. I wasn't aware of additional tribal requirements. The admission revealed either academic naivety about indigenous rights or deliberate institutional disregard for tribal sovereignty. Universities frequently conducted research on reservation land without seeking tribal consent, treating indigenous territories like federal parks where academic credentials provided automatic access to natural resources and cultural materials. What kind of research are you conducting? Marcus asked, noting that her collecting activities had focused specifically on plants with known medicinal properties rather than general botanical survey work. Ethnobotanical documentation, Sarah replied. We're cataloging traditional medicinal plants before climate change and development pressure make them unavailable for future study. The research is intended to preserve indigenous knowledge, not exploit it. The explanation was commonly used by academic institutions to justify research that often resulted in commercial applications without tribal consent or benefit. Marcus had encountered similar projects before, well-intentioned academic work that became the foundation for pharmaceutical patents that generated substantial profits while the tribes, who had preserved the original knowledge, received nothing. Indigenous knowledge belongs to indigenous peoples, Marcus said. Preservation efforts that don't include tribal participation and control are another form of cultural appropriation, regardless of academic intentions. Sarah studied his expression, recognizing authority that extended beyond federal law enforcement to encompass cultural protection and sovereignty issues that her academic training hadn't adequately addressed. You're right, she said after a moment. I should have researched tribal consultation requirements before beginning fieldwork. My department's briefing was obviously incomplete. The acknowledgement was unusual. Most academic researchers became defensive when confronted about tribal rights violations, claiming that university permissions overrode indigenous sovereignty or that their research served higher scientific purposes that justified bypassing tribal consultation requirements. Sarah's willingness to accept responsibility suggested either genuine respect for tribal authority or sophisticated understanding of the legal problems she was facing. Dr. Mitchell, Marcus said, using her academic title to acknowledge her professional credentials while maintaining his authority over the situation. Your options are to leave tribal land immediately and abandon this research, or to request proper tribal authorization through official channels that might take months to process. Is there a third option? Sarah asked. I have 3 more days of fieldwork scheduled, and some of the plants I'm documenting only flower during this specific season. If I leave now, I'll lose an entire year of research opportunity. Marcus considered her request, weighing enforcement requirements against the possibility that legitimate ethnobotanical research might benefit tribal interests if conducted with proper oversight and benefit-sharing agreements. Academic documentation of traditional medicinal plants could support tribal efforts to protect important species and habitats from development pressure. There might be, he said, but it would require tribal supervision, community consultation, and formal agreements about how the research results would be used. Are you prepared for that level of accountability? Sarah's response would determine whether she was a serious researcher who respected tribal sovereignty or another academic opportunist who viewed indigenous territories as convenient sources of data for career advancement. Her answer would also influence Marcus's decision about whether to pursue federal enforcement action or explore the possibility of turning unauthorized research into collaborative partnership. The morning sun climbed higher above the creek bottom, illuminating medicinal plants that had sustained tribal healers for countless generations and now attracted outside researchers who might either help preserve traditional knowledge or exploit it for commercial gain. The choice between protection and cooperation would depend on Sarah Mitchell's willingness to accept tribal authority over research that involved indigenous cultural heritage. Marcus waited for her answer, prepared to either escort her off tribal land or begin the complex process of transforming a confrontation into an opportunity for genuine collaboration between indigenous knowledge holders and academic researchers who understood that some forms of knowledge required different relationships than conventional scientific extraction. Sarah Mitchell's answer came without hesitation, surprising Marcus with its directness. Yes, I'm prepared for that level of accountability. My research isn't worth anything if it doesn't respect the people whose knowledge I'm trying to document. She paused, looking out over the creek where morning light filtered through cottonwood leaves. I became an ethnobotanist because I believe traditional ecological knowledge is crucial for addressing climate change and biodiversity loss. But if I'm contributing to cultural exploitation instead of preservation, then I'm part of the problem. Marcus studied her expression, looking for signs of academic manipulation or calculated responses designed to avoid legal consequences. But Sarah's acknowledgement seemed genuine, carrying the weight of someone who had recognized a serious professional and ethical mistake. Her willingness to accept tribal oversight represented either sophisticated understanding of indigenous rights or remarkable adaptability for an academic researcher whose career depended on data collection and publication schedules. Tribal consultation isn't a formality, Marcus warned. It means submitting your research proposal to the Cultural Preservation Committee, presenting your methodology to traditional healers, and accepting their authority over what knowledge can be shared and how it can be used. Some information may be declared off-limits entirely. Are you prepared for that possibility? I understand, Sarah replied. Traditional knowledge holders have the right to control access to their cultural heritage. If they determine that certain information shouldn't be documented or shared, I'll respect that decision. Her response indicated familiarity with indigenous intellectual property concepts that many academic researchers ignored or dismissed as obstacles to scientific progress. Marcus's experience with university-sponsored projects had taught him to be skeptical of researchers who claimed to respect tribal authority while designing studies that assumed indigenous knowledge belonged to the global scientific community. There's something else, Marcus continued. Any research conducted on tribal land becomes subject to tribal copyright and benefit-sharing agreements. If your documentation leads to commercial applications, the Crow Nation would be entitled to compensation and consultation about how traditional knowledge is used. Most universities aren't prepared for that level of indigenous control. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. My department focuses on academic publication rather than commercial development, but you're right that research results can be used in ways that researchers don't anticipate or control. Benefit-sharing agreements would actually protect both tribal interests and academic integrity. The conversation was moving in directions that Marcus hadn't expected when he first confronted what appeared to be another unauthorized researcher extracting tribal resources for outside benefit. Sarah's responses suggested either genuine commitment to collaborative research or sophisticated understanding of the legal requirements necessary to continue her work on tribal land. I'll need to confiscate your current specimens, Marcus said. testing her reaction to the loss of several days' work. Anything collected without tribal permission can't be used in research that claims to respect indigenous rights. Sarah handed over her collecting bags without protest, though Marcus could see the disappointment in her expression as she surrendered plant samples that represented careful fieldwork in difficult terrain. "I understand," she said. "If I'm going to do this research properly, I need to start over with tribal approval and oversight." The gesture convinced Marcus that her commitment to collaboration might be authentic. Academic researchers typically fought any requirement that forced them to abandon data they had already collected, viewing tribal consultation as bureaucratic interference with scientific progress rather than essential ethical practice. "There's a tribal council meeting tomorrow evening," Marcus said, making a decision that surprised him with its spontaneity. "If you're serious about requesting research permission, that's where you'll need to present your proposal. But I should warn you that the Cultural Preservation Committee includes elders who have seen too many researchers make promises they didn't keep. What would improve my chances of approval?" Sarah asked, demonstrating practical awareness that tribal consultation required more than academic credentials and good intentions. Marcus considered her question, recognizing an opportunity to educate an outside researcher about indigenous perspectives. "On collaborative scholarship, demonstrate that you understand the difference between extractive research and reciprocal partnership. Show that you're committed to building relationships rather than just collecting data. And be prepared to explain how your work will benefit the Crow Nation, not just your academic career." Sarah pulled out a field notebook and began taking notes, treating his advice as essential information rather than optional suggestions. What kind of benefits would be most meaningful to the tribal community? She asked. The question revealed either genuine interest in tribal priorities or calculated strategy to improve her chances of research approval. Marcus decided to treat it as an opportunity to assess her sincerity while providing information that could benefit both her research and tribal interests. "Educational partnerships," he said. "Training programs that teach tribal youth to document and preserve traditional ecological knowledge using both indigenous methods and modern scientific techniques. Research that supports tribal arguments for protecting sacred sites and medicinal plant habitats from development pressure. Documentation that strengthens tribal legal cases for environmental protection and treaty rights enforcement." Sarah's note-taking became more intensive as Marcus outlined collaborative possibilities that could transform her individual research, project into broader partnership between the university and tribal institutions. "Those outcomes would actually make my research more valuable than anything I could accomplish working alone," she said. "Would the tribal college be interested in developing joint programs?" Her question suggested understanding that sustainable research partnerships required institutional relationships rather than individual agreements between outside researchers and tribal authorities. Marcus had encountered few academic researchers who grasped the importance of building long-term collaborative infrastructure instead of pursuing short-term data extraction projects. Dr. Patricia Crow-Feather directs the Environmental Science program at Little Bighorn College, Marcus said. She's also a traditional healer and member of the Cultural Preservation Committee. "If anyone could help you develop a collaborative research proposal, it would be her. Would you be willing to introduce me?" Sarah asked. "My credibility with tribal authorities would obviously benefit from your endorsement, but I don't want to presume on your time or put you in an awkward position." The request demonstrated diplomatic awareness of the delicate relationships between tribal law enforcement, academic institutions, and traditional cultural authorities. Marcus appreciated her recognition that his introduction would carry weight with tribal decision-makers, but also that his reputation could be damaged if he endorsed researchers who proved unreliable or exploitative. "I'll consider it," Marcus said, "but first, I want to see how you handle the rest of today. You can observe my afternoon patrols and learn about other threats to tribal sovereignty, that your research might help address. Consider it an orientation to the broader context of cultural preservation work. Sarah's willingness to spend time learning about tribal law enforcement priorities rather than rushing to submit her research proposal impressed Marcus as evidence of genuine interest in building relationships rather than simply obtaining permissions. Academic researchers typically viewed tribal consultation as a bureaucratic requirement to be completed as quickly as possible, not an opportunity to understand indigenous perspectives on research collaboration. They spent the afternoon visiting locations where Marcus documented ongoing sovereignty violations, from unauthorized archaeological excavations to illegal hunting by non-tribal members who claimed treaty rights they didn't possess. Sarah observed his evidence-gathering techniques and asked informed questions about the legal frameworks that governed tribal jurisdiction over reservation land. Her background in environmental science proved valuable for understanding the ecological implications of sovereignty violations that Marcus encountered daily. Energy development, unauthorized research, and recreational trespassing all contributed to habitat degradation that threatened the medicinal plants and ceremonial materials that traditional healers depended on for their work. "This is much more complex than I realized," Sarah admitted as they documented evidence of unauthorized cattle grazing in an area where rare medicinal plants had been trampled by livestock that shouldn't have been on tribal land. Academic research is just one of many pressures that tribal authorities have to manage. Her observation demonstrated growing awareness of the broader context within which tribal decision-makers evaluated research proposals. Requests for access to traditional knowledge and cultural resources had to be considered alongside ongoing threats from energy development, recreational tourism, and federal agencies that viewed tribal sovereignty as an obstacle to efficient resource management. Tribal authorities deal with dozens of requests every month, Marcus explained as they completed documentation of the grazing violation. Researchers, documentary filmmakers, government agencies, corporate representatives, and recreational groups all want access to tribal land and cultural resources. The Cultural Preservation Committee has to evaluate each request based on potential benefits and risks to tribal interests. How do they distinguish between legitimate collaborative opportunities and extractive projects disguised as partnerships? Sarah asked. The question revealed sophisticated understanding of the challenges that tribal authorities faced when evaluating proposals from outside institutions that claim to support indigenous interests while pursuing their own professional and economic objectives. Long-term commitment, Marcus said. Researchers who disappear after collecting their data don't contribute to tribal capacity building or ongoing cultural preservation efforts. Institutions that maintain relationships beyond individual research projects demonstrate genuine commitment to collaborative partnership. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. One-time data extraction projects can't build the trust necessary for accessing sensitive cultural knowledge. As the afternoon progressed, Marcus found himself impressed by Sarah's ability to understand complex sovereignty issues that many academic researchers ignored or dismissed as irrelevant to their scientific work. Her questions demonstrated genuine curiosity about tribal perspectives rather than strategic calculation of responses that would facilitate research approval. More importantly, she seemed to grasp that collaborative research required personal relationships built on mutual respect and shared commitment to cultural preservation, rather than formal agreements that prioritized academic freedom over indigenous control of cultural heritage. By evening, Marcus had decided that Sarah Mitchell represented a rare opportunity for the kind of collaborative research that could benefit both tribal interests and academic scholarship. Her willingness to accept tribal oversight, her commitment to relationship building, and her understanding of sovereignty issues suggested that she might be capable of the long-term partnership that effective cultural preservation required. "I'll introduce you to Dr. Crowfeather tomorrow," he said as they returned to the location where Sarah had left her vehicle. "But I want you to understand that this introduction creates obligations for both of us. If you prove unreliable or exploitative, it reflects on my judgment and damages my credibility with tribal authorities." "I understand," Sarah replied. "And I want you to know that this day has changed my perspective on what collaborative research really means. I'm committed to earning the trust you're offering, even if it takes years to build the relationships necessary for meaningful partnership." The sincerity in her voice convinced Marcus that his decision to support her research proposal was worth the professional risk it represented. Tomorrow would determine whether Sarah Mitchell could transform good intentions into the kind of sustained commitment that genuine collaboration required. The tribal council chambers occupied the center of the government complex, a building designed to blend traditional architectural elements with modern administrative functions. Circular seating arrangements honored the indigenous concept that all voices held equal importance in community decision-making, while advanced audiovisual equipment allowed for detailed presentation of research proposals and legal documents. That required careful examination by tribal authorities. Marcus arrived 30 minutes before the evening session to brief Dr. Patricia Crowfeather about Sarah's research proposal and his assessment of her suitability for collaborative partnership. Dr. Crowfeather, a woman in her mid-50s whose gray hair was kept in traditional braids adorned with silver and turquoise, possessed credentials that bridged indigenous knowledge systems and academic science in ways that few people had achieved. Her doctoral dissertation had documented traditional ecological relationships that mainstream environmental science was only beginning to understand, while her role as a traditional healer connected her to knowledge systems that had sustained tribal communities for countless generations. The Cultural Preservation Committee trusted her judgment about research proposals because she understood both the value and the vulnerabilities of indigenous knowledge systems. "Tell me about this ethnobotanist," Dr. Crowfeather said as they reviewed Sarah's academic credentials and research proposal in her office adjacent to the council chambers. "What makes you think she's different from the other university researchers who've requested access to traditional medicinal knowledge?" Marcus had spent the morning helping Sarah refine her presentation, ensuring that her proposal addressed tribal priorities rather than simply requesting permission to continue academic work that served university interests. Her willingness to revise her research methodology based on tribal feedback had impressed him as evidence of genuine commitment to collaborative partnership. "She understands that indigenous knowledge belongs to indigenous peoples," Marcus replied. "When I told her that unauthorized specimens couldn't be used in research that claimed to respect tribal rights, she surrendered 3 days of fieldwork without argument. Most academic researchers would have fought that requirement." Dr. Crowfeather nodded approvingly. "Respect for intellectual property is essential, but it's also the minimum requirement for any collaborative relationship. What else makes her proposal worth considering?" "She's prepared to accept long-term tribal oversight and benefit-sharing agreements," Marcus continued. "Her research could support our legal arguments for protecting medicinal plant habitats from development pressure. And she's interested in developing educational partnerships that would train tribal youth in documentation techniques." The educational component was particularly important to Dr. Crowfeather, whose work at the tribal college focused on preparing young tribal members to address environmental challenges that threaten both traditional knowledge systems and the natural resources they depended on. Climate change, industrial development, and habitat loss were creating urgent needs for systematic documentation of traditional ecological knowledge before it was lost forever. "Has she demonstrated understanding that some knowledge can't be shared outside the tribal community?" Dr. Crowfeather asked. Academic researchers often assume that scientific documentation automatically creates public access to indigenous cultural heritage. Marcus had addressed this concern during his afternoon orientation with Sarah, explaining that traditional healers maintained strict protocols about which knowledge could be shared with outsiders and which information remained sacred or dangerous in the wrong hands. Her response had convinced him that she understood the difference between collaborative research and cultural extraction. She's prepared to accept restrictions on publication and data sharing, Marcus said. Her proposal includes provisions for tribal review of all research results before academic submission, and she's agreed to exclude sensitive cultural information from any published documentation. Dr. Crowfeather's expression suggested cautious optimism about the possibility of genuine collaborative research that could benefit both tribal knowledge preservation and academic understanding of traditional ecological systems. Too many previous partnerships had failed because university researchers ultimately prioritized academic freedom over indigenous control of cultural heritage. I'll support her presentation to the Cultural Preservation Committee, Dr. Crowfeather decided. But the final decision belongs to the traditional healers who would be sharing their knowledge. If they're not comfortable with her approach or her long-term commitment, the proposal will be rejected regardless of academic credentials. The council chambers filled gradually as evening approached, tribal members arriving for the monthly session that addressed everything from budget approvals to environmental protection measures. The Cultural Preservation Committee occupied designated seating that honored their special responsibility for safeguarding traditional knowledge and cultural practices that connected the Crow Nation to its ancestral heritage. Sarah arrived precisely on time, wearing professional attire that showed respect for the formal setting while avoiding styles that might appear presumptuous or culturally inappropriate. She carried a leather portfolio containing her revised research proposal, supporting documentation, and visual materials that would help explain her methodology to committee members whose expertise came from traditional knowledge systems rather than academic training. Marcus introduced her to Dr. Crowfeather and other key committee members, noting their areas of expertise and their particular concerns about collaborative research projects. Sarah listened carefully to each introduction, asking informed questions about their work and demonstrating genuine interest in their perspectives on cultural preservation challenges. Dr. Mitchell, Dr. Crowfeather began when the committee was ready to hear her presentation. We understand that you're requesting permission to conduct ethnobotanical research on tribal land. Please explain why this research would benefit the Crow Nation rather than simply advancing your academic career. Sarah's response demonstrated the collaborative approach that Marcus had helped her develop during their preparation sessions. Instead of focusing on scientific methodology or publication goals, she emphasized community benefits and long-term partnership opportunities that could strengthen tribal capacity for protecting traditional knowledge and natural resources. Traditional ecological knowledge represents thousands of years of careful observation and experimentation, Sarah said. Climate change and habitat loss are threatening both the plants and the knowledge systems that depend on them. My research could provide documentation that supports tribal legal arguments for environmental protection, while also training tribal youth in scientific techniques that complement traditional knowledge preservation methods. Elder Joseph Old Coyote, a traditional healer whose knowledge of medicinal plants was legendary throughout the Northern Plains tribes, leaned forward in his seat. "Young woman," he said in accented English that carried the authority of someone who had spent decades protecting sacred knowledge from exploitation. Many researchers have made similar promises. How do we know you won't disappear with our knowledge once you've collected what you need for your degree? The question cut to the heart of tribal concerns about collaborative research. Too many academic partnerships had ended when researchers completed their data collection and moved on to other projects, leaving tribal communities with no ongoing benefits from knowledge they had shared in good faith. Sarah's answer reflected understanding of the trust issues that previous researchers had created through their extractive approaches to indigenous knowledge. I'm not requesting a short-term data collection project, she said. I'm proposing a long-term partnership that would continue beyond my current research. If the Crow Nation is willing to invest in training me as a collaborative researcher, I'm prepared to invest my career in supporting tribal knowledge preservation and environmental protection efforts. Elder Mary Pretty on Top, whose expertise in traditional plant medicines had earned respect from healers throughout the region, studied Sarah's expression carefully. What happens if your university disagrees with tribal decisions about what knowledge can be shared? She asked. Academic institutions often prioritize publication over indigenous intellectual property rights. The question addressed a fundamental conflict between academic freedom and tribal sovereignty that had undermined many previous research partnerships. Universities typically insisted on their right to publish research results without external censorship, while tribal authorities demanded control over how traditional knowledge was documented and disseminated. I've discussed this issue with my department chair, Sarah replied. The University of Colorado has agreed to honor tribal copyright and benefit-sharing agreements for this project. If conflicts arise about publication rights, tribal authority will take precedence over university policies. Dr. Crow Feather looked surprised by this concession, which represented unusual flexibility from an academic institution that typically insisted on unrestricted research publication. You have that agreement in writing? She asked. Sarah provided documentation showing that her university had accepted legal liability for respecting tribal intellectual property rights, even if such agreements limited academic publication opportunities. The concession demonstrated either genuine institutional commitment to collaborative research or Sarah's exceptional ability to negotiate academic support for indigenous partnership requirements. This is encouraging, Elder Old Coyote admitted. But academic agreements can be modified when researchers change positions or university administrations change priorities. How do we protect tribal interests if your personal circumstances change? Sarah had anticipated this concern and prepared responses that addressed the long-term sustainability of collaborative research partnerships. The research protocols we develop could be transferred to tribal institutions if my university involvement ends, she said. Dr. Crow Feather and I have discussed the possibility of training tribal college students in ethnobotanical documentation techniques that would allow the Crow Nation to continue knowledge preservation work independently. The proposal for technology transfer represented a significant departure from typical academic research models that kept universities in control of scientific methodologies and data analysis techniques. Sarah's willingness to share technical expertise with tribal institutions suggested genuine commitment to building indigenous capacity rather than maintaining academic dependence. Elder Pretty on Top exchanged glances with other committee members, silently communicating through gestures that reflected decades of collaborative decision-making about cultural preservation issues. We'll need time to discuss your proposal privately, she said. Please wait outside while the Cultural Preservation Committee deliberates. Marcus accompanied Sarah to the hallway outside the council chambers, where they waited while traditional healers and cultural authorities evaluated her research proposal according to criteria that prioritized tribal interests over academic considerations. The deliberation process could take anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours, depending on the complexity of issues raised by committee members. How do you think it went? Sarah asked, her nervousness evident despite her professional composure. During the formal presentation, better than most, Marcus replied honestly. You addressed their major concerns about long-term commitment and benefit sharing. But the final decision depends on whether the traditional healers believe you can be trusted with sensitive cultural knowledge. The weight of that trust was significant. Traditional healers had spent lifetimes learning to distinguish between medicinal plants and dangerous species, between appropriate applications and potentially harmful uses, between knowledge that could be shared safely and information that required careful protection. Their willingness to work with outside researchers required confidence that collaborative partners would respect the sacred responsibility that came with access to traditional knowledge systems. After 90 minutes of deliberation, Dr. Crowfeather emerged from the council chambers with an expression that revealed nothing about the committee's decision. "Dr. Mitchell," she said formally, "the Cultural Preservation Committee has reached a decision about your research proposal." Dr. Crowfeather's expression remained carefully neutral as she delivered the committee's decision. "The Cultural Preservation Committee has approved your research proposal with conditions," she announced. "You'll work under the direct supervision of Elder Pretty on Top, who will determine which medicinal plants can be documented and which knowledge remains restricted. All research results must be reviewed by the committee before any academic publication or data sharing occurs." Sarah's relief was visible, but she maintained professional composure as she accepted the terms that would govern her collaborative research. "I'm honored by the committee's trust," she said. "When can I begin working with Elder Pretty on Top?" "Tomorrow morning," Dr. Crowfeather replied. "Elder Pretty on Top wants to evaluate your fieldwork skills and your understanding of traditional protocols before she shares any sensitive knowledge. Marcus will accompany you for the first week to ensure that cultural boundaries are respected." The arrangement meant that Marcus would spend considerable time working closely with Sarah, observing her interactions with traditional healers and evaluating her commitment to collaborative research principles. His role as cultural liaison carried responsibility for protecting tribal interests while facilitating legitimate scholarly partnership. As they left the tribal council building, Sarah's excitement about the approved research was tempered by awareness of the serious obligations she had accepted. "This is more responsibility than I expected," she admitted. "Working with traditional healers requires different skills than academic research." "Elder Pretty on Top doesn't accept students lightly," Marcus warned. "She's trained healers from tribes across the northern plains, but she's also refused to work with people who couldn't demonstrate proper respect for traditional knowledge. You'll be evaluated on your character as much as your academic credentials." The next morning brought Sarah's first lesson in traditional plant gathering, which began before sunrise with prayers and ceremonies that honored the relationship between humans and the natural world. Elder Pretty on Top, a woman in her 70s, whose knowledge of medicinal plants was encyclopedic, led them to gathering sites that had been used by tribal healers for generations. "Plants are teachers," Elder Pretty on Top explained as they walked through creek bottom areas where morning mist revealed dozens of medicinal species. "They offer their medicine to people who approach with respect and reciprocity." Academic researchers often forget that knowledge has responsibilities as well as benefits. Sarah listened carefully as the elder described traditional protocols for gathering medicinal plants, including prayers of gratitude, seasonal timing restrictions, and sustainable harvesting techniques that ensured plant populations would remain healthy for future generations. Her notebook filled with information that no university course had ever provided about the spiritual and ecological relationships that surrounded traditional medicine. "Why did you choose to study plants?" Elder Pretty on Top asked as they paused beside a patch of rare medicinal herbs that grew only in specific soil conditions. "My grandmother was an herbalist in Kentucky," Sarah replied. "She taught me that plants could heal conditions that conventional medicine couldn't address effectively. When I learned about traditional ecological knowledge in graduate school, I realized that indigenous peoples had developed sophisticated understanding of plant medicines that academic science was just beginning to appreciate." The personal connection impressed Elder Pretty on Top, who had encountered too many academic researchers whose interest in traditional knowledge was purely intellectual rather than grounded in lived experience with plant-based healing. Sarah's grandmother had provided foundation for understanding relationships between humans and medicinal plants that formal education alone couldn't convey. Over the following days, Sarah demonstrated fieldwork skills and cultural sensitivity that earned gradual acceptance from Elder Pretty on top. She learned to identify medicinal plants by traditional names, as well as scientific classifications, to understand seasonal patterns that determined when different medicines were most potent, and to recognize signs that indicated which plants could be harvested sustainably. More importantly, she began to understand the difference between information and knowledge, between data collection and wisdom transmission. Traditional healers didn't simply memorize plant properties. They developed relationships with medicinal species that required years of careful observation and respectful interaction. You learn quickly. Elder Pretty on top observed after Sarah correctly identified a rare medicinal plant and explained its traditional uses without consulting her field notes. But academic learning is different from healer training. Can you accept that some knowledge may never be appropriate for your research? Yes, Sarah replied without hesitation. Some knowledge belongs only to the people who have earned the right to receive it through proper training and spiritual preparation. I'm grateful for whatever teachings you're willing to share. Marcus watched these interactions with growing respect for Sarah's ability to adapt to traditional learning methods that emphasized patient observation and humble acceptance of limitations, rather than aggressive data collection and analytical categorization. Her willingness to work within indigenous knowledge systems suggested genuine commitment to collaborative research. The peaceful routine of traditional plant gathering was interrupted on the fourth day when Marcus received an urgent call from tribal headquarters about a new crisis developing on reservation boundaries. Yellowstone Energy Corporation had accelerated their illegal surveying activities, bringing in heavy equipment for seismic testing that would cause permanent damage to sacred sites and medicinal plant habitats. They're moving faster than expected, Marcus told Sarah and Elder Pretty on top, as he prepared to respond to the emergency. The energy company knows that federal investigators are examining their previous violations, so they're trying to complete as much unauthorized work as possible before enforcement actions can stop them. Elder Pretty on top's expression darkened with anger that Marcus had rarely seen from the traditionally patient healer. They're destroying medicine plants that have grown in those places for centuries, she said. Some of those species exist nowhere else in the region. If the energy company damages those habitats, traditional healers will lose access to medicines that can't be replaced. The crisis represented a direct threat to the ethnobotanical research that Sarah had just begun, but also to the traditional healing knowledge that Elder Pretty on top had spent decades preserving and transmitting. Sacred plants that required specific environmental conditions might be eliminated permanently by industrial activities that prioritize short-term resource extraction over long-term ecological sustainability. Can I help with the response? Sarah asked, recognizing that her research depended on protecting the plant habitats that energy development threatened to destroy. I have experience documenting environmental damage for legal proceedings. Marcus considered her offer, weighing the potential benefits of additional expertise against the risks of involving an outside researcher in tribal law enforcement activities. Sarah's scientific training could strengthen legal cases against energy companies, but her presence might also complicate federal investigations that required careful coordination between tribal authorities and outside agencies. Federal investigators are already involved, Marcus explained. Your documentation could support the legal case, but you'd need to understand that this isn't academic research anymore. Energy companies employ security contractors and legal teams that play hardball when their projects are threatened. Sarah's response reflected determination that surprised Marcus with its intensity. Those medicinal plants represent thousands of years of traditional knowledge, she said. If industrial development destroys them, my research becomes meaningless because there won't be any traditional ecological relationships left to document. Elder Pretty on top studied Sarah's expression carefully, evaluating whether the young Researcher possessed the courage and commitment necessary for defending traditional knowledge against corporate assault. "This is what I've been waiting to see," the elder said finally. Academic researchers often support indigenous rights in theory, but disappear when real conflicts require personal risk. The elder's approval carried weight that extended beyond research permissions to include acceptance into the community of people who actively defended tribal sovereignty and cultural preservation. Sarah had passed a test that she hadn't realized she was taking, demonstrating that her commitment to collaborative research extended to protecting the cultural foundations that made such partnerships possible. They spent the remainder of the day traveling to the threatened area, where Yellowstone Energy had established a major operation that included seismic testing equipment, temporary roads that carved through sensitive habitats, and security personnel who were prepared to resist federal enforcement efforts. The scale of the operation indicated corporate determination to complete resource extraction surveys, regardless of legal consequences. "This is worse than I expected," Marcus said as they documented the extent of environmental damage from a ridge that overlooked the energy company's installation. "They're not just conducting unauthorized surveys anymore. They're preparing for full-scale industrial development." Sarah's scientific training was evident in her systematic approach to documenting ecological damage that could support federal prosecution of treaty violations and environmental crimes. Her photographs captured evidence of habitat destruction that would be crucial for legal proceedings, while her written observations provided technical analysis that complemented Marcus's law enforcement documentation. The medicinal plant habitats in that canyon represent irreplaceable ecological relationships, Sarah reported as she completed her damage assessment. "Some of those species have co-evolved with specific soil conditions and water sources that have remained stable for thousands of years. Industrial development would eliminate environmental conditions that can't be recreated artificially." Elder Pretty on Top's grief was visible as she surveyed destruction that threatened traditional healing, knowledge she had spent her lifetime preserving. "My grandmother gathered medicine in that canyon," she said quietly. "Her grandmother did the same. If the energy company destroys those places, the chain of knowledge transmission that connects us to our ancestors will be broken." The emotional weight of cultural loss transformed Sarah's academic research into something more personal and urgent. She was no longer simply documenting traditional ecological knowledge. She was participating in efforts to prevent the destruction of indigenous knowledge systems that corporate development threatened to eliminate permanently. "What's our next step?" Sarah asked, recognizing that collaborative research now required active participation in cultural preservation battles that extended far beyond academic documentation. That Marcus appreciated her use of "our," which indicated genuine partnership rather than outside assistance with tribal problems. Sarah had evolved from unauthorized researcher to collaborative partner to active participant in sovereignty defense, demonstrating commitment that few academic researchers had ever shown to indigenous communities. "We build a federal case that's strong enough to shut down their operation permanently," Marcus replied. "Your scientific documentation, combined with my law enforcement evidence and Elder Pretty on Top's testimony about cultural significance, should provide everything federal prosecutors need to pursue serious criminal charges." The next phase of their partnership would test whether collaborative research could contribute to protecting the traditional knowledge systems that made such partnerships possible in the first place. Sarah's academic credentials would be measured not by publication success, but by her effectiveness in defending indigenous intellectual property and cultural heritage against corporate assault. As evening approached, they prepared for a confrontation that would determine whether traditional healing knowledge would survive industrial development pressure or join the countless indigenous cultural practices that had been lost to economic interests that viewed tribal sovereignty as an obstacle to profitable resource extraction. The federal response team arrived at dawn, bringing Marcus the kind of backup he had requested, but rarely received for treaty violations on tribal land. FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres, a Navajo woman whose reputation for prosecuting crimes against indigenous communities had earned respect throughout Indian country, led a joint task force that included Environmental Protection Agency investigators, U.S. Marshals, and tribal law enforcement officers from 3 different reservations. "We've been building a case against Yellowstone Energy for months," Agent Torres explained as the task force assembled at tribal headquarters. "Their pattern of unauthorized activities on tribal lands across 4 states suggests organized criminal conspiracy to violate federal treaty obligations and environmental protection laws. Your documentation from the Crow Reservation provides the evidence we need to pursue RICO charges." Marcus had worked with federal investigators before, but never with the level of resources and legal authority that Agent Torres commanded. Her task force represented unprecedented federal commitment to prosecuting corporate violations of tribal sovereignty, suggesting that political pressure from multiple tribal nations had finally created consequences for energy companies that treated indigenous lands as unprotected territories. "What's our operational plan?" Marcus asked, noting the tactical equipment and arrest warrants that indicated the federal team was prepared for potential resistance from energy company security. "Personnel. Simultaneous raids on 3 separate operations," Agent Torres replied, spreading maps across the conference table that showed Yellowstone Energy installations on Crow, Northern Cheyenne, and Fort Belknap reservation lands. "We shut down all their unauthorized activities at the same time to prevent evidence destruction and ensure that corporate executives can't claim they were unaware of violations occurring on tribal territory." Sarah had been invited to participate as a scientific expert whose documentation would support federal prosecution efforts, but her role would expose her to physical danger and legal complications that most academic researchers avoided. Energy. Companies employed security contractors with military backgrounds who were trained to resist federal enforcement actions through intimidation and potential violence. "Are you prepared for this level of confrontation?" Marcus asked Sarah privately as the federal team completed operational planning. Energy company security personnel aren't campus police. They're former military contractors who view tribal sovereignty as an obstacle to profitable resource extraction. Sarah's response reflected determination that had solidified during her weeks of working with traditional healers who faced constant threats to their cultural heritage. "Those medicinal plants represent knowledge that took thousands of years to develop," she said. "If I'm not willing to defend the foundations of traditional ecological knowledge, then my research is just another form of exploitation." Her answer convinced Marcus that Sarah understood the difference between academic study of indigenous knowledge and active participation in cultural preservation battles that required personal courage and professional risk. Few university researchers had ever demonstrated willingness to confront corporate power on behalf of tribal interests. The convoy that departed tribal headquarters included vehicles designed for tactical operations in remote terrain where energy companies had established heavily fortified installations protected by private security forces. Marcus rode with Agent Torres and Sarah in an armored FBI vehicle equipped with communication systems that could coordinate with federal prosecutors in Billings and Washington, D.C. "Yellowstone Energy has invested millions in this extraction project," Agent Torres explained as they approached the target area. "They're not going to surrender their equipment voluntarily, especially since federal prosecution could result in criminal charges against corporate executives who authorized unauthorized activities on tribal land." The energy company installation had expanded significantly since Marcus's last reconnaissance, now including permanent structures that suggested long-term operational plans rather than temporary surveying activities. Multiple drilling rigs, processing equipment, and storage facilities indicated preparation for full-scale resource extraction that would permanently transform the sacred landscape where tribal healers had gathered medicinal plants for countless generations. "This is a major industrial operation," Sarah observed as they surveyed the installation from a concealed position. "The environmental damage extends far beyond the immediate drilling sites. They've altered water flow patterns, destroyed vegetation across hundreds of acres, and contaminated soil with industrial chemicals." Her scientific assessment provided federal investigators with technical evidence that would support environmental crime prosecutions under laws that impose severe penalties for damaging ecosystems on tribal lands. Energy companies that violated environmental protection regulations in Indian country faced both criminal charges and civil liability that could reach hundreds of millions of dollars. The federal operation began with simultaneous service of search warrants and arrest warrants at multiple locations within the energy company installation. U.S. Marshals secured the perimeter while FBI agents gathered evidence and EPA investigators documented environmental violations that had occurred during months of unauthorized industrial activity. Yellowstone Energy's response was immediate and aggressive. Corporate security personnel, led by a former Army colonel named James Blackwood, attempted to block federal access to drilling sites and processing facilities, while company attorneys filed emergency injunctions, claiming that federal enforcement violated corporate property rights and state energy development agreements. "You're interfering with legitimate business operations authorized by the state of Montana," Blackwood declared as he confronted Agent Torres near the main drilling platform. "Yellowstone Energy has legal permits for all activities on this site. State permits don't authorize industrial operations on sovereign tribal territory," Agent Torres replied, displaying federal arrest warrants that charged energy company executives with conspiracy to violate federal treaty obligations. "Your corporate permits are invalid because they were issued without tribal consultation required by federal law." The confrontation escalated when energy company security personnel attempted to prevent FBI agents from accessing computer systems that contained evidence of corporate planning for unauthorized resource extraction. Marcus found himself in a tactical situation that required the combat skills he had developed during military service in Afghanistan, where similar confrontations with hostile forces had prepared him for corporate resistance to federal authority. "Stand down," Marcus commanded as security contractors moved to block federal access to evidence storage areas. His authority as tribal law enforcement, combined with federal backup, carried legal weight that private security forces couldn't legally resist without risking serious criminal charges. Sarah documented the confrontation with scientific precision, photographing evidence of environmental destruction while recording corporate attempts to obstruct federal investigation. Her academic training proved valuable for maintaining detailed records that would support prosecution efforts, while her presence demonstrated academic support for tribal sovereignty that energy companies hadn't anticipated. The breakthrough came when FBI computer specialists accessed corporate planning documents that revealed Yellowstone Energy's systematic strategy for bypassing tribal consultation requirements across multiple reservations. Internal communications showed corporate executives deliberately authorizing operations on tribal lands without seeking indigenous consent, while relying on state permits that had no legal authority in Indian country. "We have evidence of organized criminal conspiracy," Agent Torres announced as she reviewed corporate documents that documented years of illegal activity. Yellowstone Energy's executives knowingly violated federal treaty obligations while attempting to extract resources worth hundreds of millions of dollars from tribal lands. The corporate conspiracy extended beyond resource extraction to include efforts to undermine tribal sovereignty through political pressure and legal challenges, designed to eliminate indigenous authority over ancestral territories. Energy company lobbying efforts had targeted federal legislators and state officials, who controlled regulatory agencies responsible for enforcing treaty obligations. Elder Pretty on Top arrived during the afternoon to witness the federal operation that was defending traditional healing knowledge against corporate destruction. Her presence provided spiritual authority that transformed law enforcement activities into cultural preservation efforts supported by both traditional indigenous knowledge and federal legal power. My grandmothers gathered medicine in these places, she told Agent Torres as they surveyed the environmental damage caused by unauthorized drilling operations. The energy company has destroyed relationships between my people and these plants that took thousands of years to develop. Some of this knowledge can never be recovered. Her testimony provided federal prosecutors with evidence of cultural destruction that would support enhanced criminal charges under federal laws protecting indigenous heritage and religious practices. Crimes against tribal cultural resources carried penalties that could result in decades of imprisonment for corporate executives who authorized such activities. The energy company's collapse was swift once federal investigators seized corporate records that documented systematic violations of treaty obligations across multiple states. Yellowstone Energy's stock price plummeted as investors recognized the criminal liability and civil damages that could bankrupt the corporation, while energy industry analysts warned that federal prosecution of treaty violations would create legal precedents that could affect resource extraction projects throughout Indian country. This is bigger than just protecting one sacred site, Marcus realized as he watched federal agents arrest energy company executives who had thought tribal sovereignty was too weak to resist corporate power. This prosecution could establish legal precedents that strengthen treaty rights for tribal nations across the entire United States. Sarah's role in providing scientific evidence for federal prosecution had transformed her from academic researcher into active participant in legal proceedings that could reshape relationships between indigenous peoples and energy corporations. Her documentation of environmental destruction would be crucial for civil litigation that could compensate tribal nations for decades of resource theft and cultural damage. I never expected that collaborative research would lead to federal criminal prosecution of corporate executives, Sarah admitted as they watched U.S. Marshals secure evidence that would support the largest prosecution of crimes against tribal sovereignty in federal court history. Traditional knowledge has always been under attack, Elder Pretty on Top replied. The difference now is that we have allies who understand that defending indigenous knowledge systems serves everyone's interests in a world where environmental destruction threatens human survival. The day's events had demonstrated that collaboration between indigenous knowledge holders, federal law enforcement, and academic researchers could create unprecedented protection for tribal sovereignty and cultural heritage. Sarah's evolution from unauthorized researcher to active defender of traditional knowledge represented the kind of partnership that could preserve indigenous wisdom for future generations, while holding corporate criminals accountable for their assault on tribal communities. As evening approached and federal investigators completed their evidence gathering, Marcus reflected on how the crisis had revealed Sarah's true character and commitment to collaborative research. She had proven herself worthy of the trust that traditional healers placed in outside researchers who claimed to respect indigenous knowledge systems. The battle was won, but the war for tribal sovereignty and cultural preservation would continue as long as corporate interests viewed indigenous lands as unprotected sources of profit rather than ancestral territories that belonged to peoples who had never surrendered their sovereignty to foreign governments or economic systems. 3 months after the federal raids, the landscape where Yellowstone Energy had conducted unauthorized drilling operations was beginning to show signs of recovery. Environmental restoration specialists working under Elder Pretty on Top's guidance had removed industrial contamination and replanted native species, using seeds from medicinal plants that tribal healers had preserved in sacred gardens maintained for emergencies exactly like this one. Sarah had extended her research partnership indefinitely, using a sabbatical from the University of Colorado to develop restoration protocols that combine traditional, ecological knowledge with modern environmental science. Her work had evolved far beyond ethnobotanical documentation to include active participation in healing landscapes that corporate extraction had damaged or destroyed. "The plants are teaching us how to repair what was broken," Elder Pridyan Top observed as they walked through areas where new growth was emerging from soil that federal specialists had spent weeks cleaning of industrial chemicals. Traditional knowledge includes understanding how ecosystems heal themselves when given proper support. Marcus had been promoted to Chief of Tribal Law Enforcement, a position that gave him authority to coordinate with federal agencies and develop legal strategies that could prevent future corporate assaults on tribal sovereignty. His success in building the case against Yellowstone Energy had earned recognition throughout Indian country as an example of effective collaboration between tribal governments and federal law enforcement. The criminal prosecution had resulted in prison sentences for 7 corporate executives, including CEO Robert Yamamoto, who received a 12-year federal sentence for conspiracy to violate treaty obligations and environmental crimes. The precedent established by the case had already deterred other energy companies from conducting unauthorized operations on tribal lands. Recognizing that federal prosecutors were now willing to pursue serious criminal charges for treaty violations, more importantly, the civil litigation had generated a settlement fund of $340 million that provided resources for environmental restoration, cultural preservation programs, and economic development initiatives that would strengthen tribal sovereignty for generations. The compensation represented the largest settlement ever achieved for crimes against tribal environmental and cultural resources. "This changes everything," Dr. Crow Feather announced during a special meeting of the Cultural Preservation Committee where Sarah was being honored for her contributions to protecting traditional knowledge. "We now have legal precedents, financial resources, and academic partnerships that can defend indigenous knowledge systems against future corporate attacks." Sarah's recognition included appointment as the first non-tribal research fellow at Little Bighorn College, a position that would allow her to continue collaborative work while training tribal youth in scientific techniques that complemented traditional knowledge preservation methods. Her commitment to long-term partnership had earned the kind of trust that academic institutions rarely achieved with indigenous communities. The transformation in Sarah's personal life had been equally dramatic. Her sabbatical from university obligations had evolved into permanent residence on the reservation, where she was building a research facility that would serve tribal colleges throughout the Northern Plains region. Her house, located near Marcus's home along the Little Bighorn River, reflected architectural traditions that honored both indigenous design principles and contemporary environmental sustainability. "I never expected to find home in a place I first entered as a trespasser," Sarah admitted during an evening walk with Marcus along the river where his ancestors had celebrated victory over Custer's forces more than a century earlier. "But this landscape has taught me things about belonging that I never learned in academic settings." Marcus had watched Sarah's evolution from unauthorized researcher to trusted community member with growing appreciation for her ability to understand relationships between people and land that most outsiders never grasped. Her willingness to invest her career in supporting tribal interests had demonstrated commitment that few non-tribal people had ever shown to indigenous communities. "Traditional knowledge has always been about relationships," Marcus replied, noting how comfortable Sarah had become with silences that allowed natural sounds to provide conversation rather than requiring constant human dialogue. Plants, animals, water, soil, and people are all connected in ways that academic science is just beginning to understand. Their relationship had deepened through shared challenges that tested both professional partnership and personal compatibility. Working together under federal investigation pressure, documenting environmental crimes, and participating in corporate prosecution had revealed character traits and values that ordinary dating relationships might never have disclosed. The evening marked the anniversary of Sarah's first unauthorized crossing of tribal boundaries, an event that had initially threatened to become another example of academic exploitation, but had instead evolved into the kind of collaborative partnership that cultural preservation required. Marcus had been planning to commemorate the anniversary with a proposal that honored both indigenous traditions and contemporary relationship customs. "There's something I want to show you," Marcus said, leading Sarah to a traditional arbor that he had constructed near the river using methods his grandfather had taught him decades earlier. The structure was decorated with star quilts made by tribal elders and surrounded by medicinal plants that elder pretty on top had helped him grow using traditional cultivation techniques. Inside the arbor, Marcus had arranged items that told the story of their partnership: photographs from the federal investigation, specimens from their collaborative research, legal documents from the Yellowstone energy prosecution, and academic papers they had published together about traditional ecological knowledge preservation. The display represented a relationship that had contributed to tribal sovereignty and cultural preservation in ways that neither had anticipated when they first met. "Sarah Mitchell," Marcus said, dropping to one knee in the traditional pose that Euro-American culture associated with marriage proposals, while holding a ring that incorporated both traditional turquoise settings and contemporary design elements. "I count Coup on enemies who threaten our people and our land, but I surrender completely to you. Will you marry me and continue building a partnership that serves our communities and protects the knowledge that connects us to this place?" The proposal combined Marcus's warrior identity with vulnerability that he had never shown to anyone else, acknowledging that traditional masculine roles could include emotional openness and collaborative partnership. His reference to counting Coup honored ancestral practices, while recognizing that modern threats required different forms of courage and commitment. Sarah's answer came without hesitation, reflecting months of contemplation about permanent commitment to both Marcus and the tribal community that had accepted her as family. "Yes," she said, accepting the ring and the proposal with tears that reflected joy rather than sadness. "I want to build a life here with you, contributing to work that honors traditional knowledge and protects it for future generations." The engagement celebration that followed drew tribal members from across the reservation, federal officials who had supported the law enforcement partnership, and academic colleagues who were amazed by Sarah's transformation from university researcher to tribal community member. The event demonstrated how individual relationships could contribute to broader cultural preservation and sovereignty protection efforts. Elder Pretty on top provided the ceremonial blessing that made their engagement official according to traditional Crow customs, while also acknowledging the contemporary challenges that their partnership would face as an interracial couple working on cultural preservation issues. Her words carried authority that connected their personal relationship to community, responsibilities, and cultural obligations. "Marriage in our tradition means accepting responsibility for each other's families and communities," the elder explained during the blessing ceremony. "Marcus and Sarah have already demonstrated commitment to our people's welfare through their work protecting traditional knowledge and tribal sovereignty. Their partnership serves as an example of how love can contribute to cultural preservation and community strength." The evening included traditional dancing, storytelling, and food sharing that introduced Sarah to ceremonial practices she would need to understand as a permanent member of the tribal community. Her participation was respectful but enthusiastic, demonstrating continued willingness to learn indigenous customs while contributing her own skills to community welfare. Dr. Crow Feather announced that Sarah's research partnership would expand to include coordination with tribal colleges across the region, creating networks that could share traditional knowledge preservation techniques while maintaining tribal control over cultural information. The initiative represented unprecedented collaboration between indigenous institutions and academic researchers who understood that effective partnerships required indigenous authority over cultural heritage. We're creating new models for how universities can work with tribal nations, Dr. Crowfeather explained to gathered community members. Sarah's commitment to long-term partnership and community membership shows that academic research can support indigenous knowledge systems rather than exploiting them. The federal prosecution had also generated legislative initiatives that would strengthen treaty enforcement and create enhanced penalties for corporate violations of tribal sovereignty. Congressman David Horn, a member of the Oneida Nation who chaired the House Subcommittee on Indigenous Affairs, had introduced legislation that would establish permanent federal task forces for investigating crimes against tribal communities. The Yellowstone Energy case proves that federal law enforcement can effectively protect tribal sovereignty when investigators understand indigenous rights and receive proper support from tribal governments, Congressman Horn announced during a visit to the reservation. This legislation would make such cooperation standard practice rather than exceptional response to crisis situations. As the celebration continued into the night, Marcus and Sarah found themselves reflecting on the journey that had brought them together through conflict and collaboration to personal commitment and community acceptance. Their relationship had contributed to protecting traditional knowledge while establishing legal precedents that would benefit tribal nations throughout the United States. I used to think that counting Coup meant defeating enemies through individual heroism, Marcus admitted as they watched traditional dancers honor their engagement with ceremonies that connected their personal relationship to community celebrations. But working with you has taught me that the greatest victories come from partnerships that serve something larger than individual success. Sarah's response reflected understanding of how personal relationships could contribute to cultural preservation and community welfare in ways that individual achievement never could. Traditional knowledge has always been about relationships between people and land, between generations, between communities, she said. Our marriage will be part of those relationships, contributing to preservation work that honors the past while protecting the future. Their engagement represented more than personal commitment. It symbolized successful collaboration between indigenous and non-indigenous peoples who shared dedication to protecting traditional knowledge and tribal sovereignty against corporate and governmental threats that required unified resistance and collaborative response. The wedding preparations took place during the late summer, when traditional seasonal ceremonies aligned with the abundance of medicinal plants that would be used in blessing rituals and healing ceremonies. Elder Pretty on Top had insisted on a full traditional wedding that would honor both Crow customs and contemporary legal requirements, creating a celebration that demonstrated how indigenous traditions could adapt to modern circumstances without losing their essential spiritual power. Sarah spent weeks learning ceremonial protocols from tribal women who had maintained wedding traditions through generations of cultural suppression and forced assimilation. The preparation process included instruction in traditional crafts, ceremonial cooking methods, and spiritual practices that connected marriage ceremonies to broader relationships between families, communities, and the natural world. Marriage in our tradition is not just about two individuals, explained Grace Two Bears, a traditional cultural instructor who was teaching Sarah the protocol she would need for the ceremony. It's about joining families, strengthening communities, and accepting responsibility for preserving cultural knowledge for future generations. The lessons extended beyond ceremonial requirements to include practical skills that would help Sarah navigate her new role as a tribal community member married to a prominent leader. Traditional food preservation, seasonal ceremony organization, and community conflict resolution techniques represented knowledge systems that formal education had never addressed. Marcus, meanwhile, was working with federal legislators and tribal attorneys to develop legal frameworks that could protect the precedents established by the Yellowstone energy prosecution. The criminal convictions had created opportunities for enhanced treaty enforcement, but those opportunities required legislative action and regulatory changes that could take years to implement effectively. We've proven that federal prosecution can protect tribal sovereignty, Marcus explained during a meeting with congressional staff members who were drafting legislation to strengthen treaty enforcement mechanisms. But we need institutional changes that make such protection routine rather than exceptional. The proposed legislation would establish permanent federal task forces specializing in crimes against tribal communities, create enhanced penalties for corporate violations of treaty obligations, and provide dedicated funding for tribal law enforcement agencies that collaborated with federal investigators. The initiative represented unprecedented congressional support for tribal sovereignty protection. Sarah's research program had expanded to include partnerships with 12 tribal colleges across the Northern Plains, creating networks for traditional knowledge preservation that operated under indigenous control while utilizing modern documentation techniques. Her work had attracted national attention from academic institutions, seeking to develop genuine collaborative relationships with tribal communities. The Crow Nation model demonstrates how universities can support indigenous knowledge systems without exploiting them, Dr. Margaret Stone Crow, president of the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, announced during a national conference on tribal education partnerships. Sarah Mitchell's commitment to community membership and long-term collaboration represents the kind of relationship that benefits both academic institutions and tribal nations. The recognition had generated invitations for Sarah to speak at universities throughout the United States about collaborative research methods that respected indigenous intellectual property rights. Her presentations consistently emphasized that effective partnerships required researchers to accept tribal authority over cultural knowledge rather than demanding academic freedom to publish whatever information they collected. The wedding ceremony itself took place in the same riverside location where Marcus had proposed, but expanded to accommodate the hundreds of community members, federal officials, and academic colleagues who wanted to celebrate a partnership that had contributed to protecting tribal sovereignty and traditional knowledge systems. Elder Pretty on top conducted the traditional ceremonies that connected the marriage to spiritual relationships between the couple, their families, and the natural world that sustained all life. Her prayers included gratitude for the healing that had occurred on lands damaged by corporate extraction, acknowledgement of the legal victories that had strengthened tribal sovereignty, and requests for continued blessing on work that served community welfare. The Creator brings people together for purposes that serve the common good, the elder said during the blessing ceremony. Marcus and Sarah have shown us how individual relationships can contribute to protecting what our ancestors preserved for future generations. Their marriage represents hope that traditional knowledge will survive and flourish. The celebration included traditional dancing, storytelling, and feasting that introduced non-tribal guests to indigenous customs while demonstrating the cultural richness that corporate development threatened to destroy. Federal officials who had participated in the law enforcement operation expressed amazement at the sophistication of cultural traditions that most Americans had never encountered. This ceremony shows why protecting tribal cultural resources is a matter of national importance, commented FBI Director Maria Gonzalez, who had attended to honor the successful prosecution that had established new precedents for federal law enforcement in Indian country. Indigenous knowledge systems represent irreplaceable cultural heritage that benefits all Americans. The honeymoon period was spent conducting research on traditional ecological restoration techniques that tribal communities were using to heal landscapes damaged by industrial development. Marcus and Sarah visited reservations throughout the western United States, documenting successful restoration projects while building networks of tribal law enforcement and academic researchers committed to protecting indigenous knowledge systems. Every tribal nation has traditional knowledge about healing damaged landscapes. Marcus observed as they documented restoration work on the Pine Ridge Reservation, where traditional prairie burning techniques were restoring grasslands that had been degraded by decades of industrial agriculture. Corporate development has damaged ecosystems throughout Indian country, but indigenous knowledge provides solutions that mainstream environmental science is just beginning to understand. Sarah's documentation of traditional restoration techniques was generating academic publications that honored tribal intellectual property rights, while sharing knowledge that could benefit broader environmental protection efforts. Her approach demonstrated how collaborative research could serve both indigenous communities and environmental conservation, without exploiting traditional knowledge for outside benefit. The research travel also provided opportunities for Marcus to share law enforcement strategies with tribal police departments that were developing their own programs for protecting cultural resources and investigating treaty violations. His success in building federal cases had inspired other tribal law enforcement agencies to pursue more aggressive prosecution of crimes against indigenous communities. Tribal sovereignty means nothing without enforcement mechanisms, Marcus explained during a training session for tribal police officers from the Blackfeet Nation. Federal law provides the tools for protecting treaty rights, but tribal law enforcement agencies need to understand how to build cases that federal prosecutors can win in court. The training programs Marcus was developing would create networks of tribal law enforcement professionals who could share intelligence about corporate threats and coordinate responses to crimes that crossed reservation boundaries. The initiative represented systematic approach to protecting tribal sovereignty rather than isolated responses to individual violations. Their return to the Crow Reservation brought news that the federal legislation inspired by the Yellowstone Energy case had passed both houses of Congress and would be signed into law by President Jennifer Walsh, whose administration had made strengthening tribal sovereignty a priority domestic policy initiative. The Tribal Sovereignty Protection Act represents historic federal commitment to enforcing treaty obligations. Congressman Horn announced during a signing ceremony at the White House that included tribal leaders from across the United States. This legislation provides legal tools and financial resources that will make crimes against tribal communities federal priorities rather than neglected violations. The law established permanent federal task forces for investigating crimes in Indian country, created enhanced penalties for corporate violations of treaty rights, and provided dedicated funding for tribal law enforcement agencies that met federal training and certification standards. Marcus had been selected to direct the new Northern Plains Regional Task Force, a position that would coordinate federal and tribal law enforcement across multiple states. Sarah's research program received federal funding to expand traditional knowledge preservation efforts to tribal communities throughout the United States, creating the first national network for indigenous intellectual property protection operated under tribal control. Her work would train tribal youth in documentation techniques while ensuring that traditional knowledge remained under community authority. We're creating institutional frameworks that can protect indigenous knowledge systems for generations, Sarah explained during a press conference announcing the federal funding. Traditional ecological knowledge represents thousands of years of careful observation and experimentation that can help address environmental challenges like climate change and biodiversity loss. The success of their collaborative efforts had attracted international attention from indigenous communities and academic institutions seeking to develop similar partnerships. Delegations from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand had visited the Crow Reservation to study their model for protecting traditional knowledge while supporting indigenous sovereignty. The Crow Nation has demonstrated that indigenous peoples can work with non-indigenous allies to protect cultural heritage without surrendering control over traditional knowledge. observed Dr. Marama Sinclair, a Maori researcher from New Zealand, who was studying their collaboration. This model could benefit indigenous communities worldwide who face similar threats from corporate development and academic exploitation. As autumn arrived, bringing the season when tribal communities traditionally gathered medicinal plants and prepared for winter ceremonies, Marcus and Sarah found themselves reflecting on how their relationship had contributed to protecting cultural traditions while establishing legal precedents that would benefit tribal nations for generations. I used to patrol these boundaries alone, always watching for threats that might cross our territorial lines, Marcus said as they walked along the fence line that marked tribal land boundaries. Now I understand that the strongest protection comes from partnerships that serve community welfare rather than individual security. Sarah's response reflected her own transformation from academic researcher pursuing individual career advancement to community member committed to collective cultural preservation. Traditional knowledge taught me that everything is connected, she said. Our marriage, our work, our community, and our land are all part of relationships that require constant attention and respectful reciprocity. Their partnership had evolved beyond personal relationship to represent successful collaboration between indigenous and non-indigenous peoples who shared commitment to protecting traditional knowledge and tribal sovereignty. The precedents they had established would influence relationships between tribal nations and federal agencies, academic institutions, and corporate interests for decades to come. The evening brought news that Elder Pretty on top had been selected to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her lifetime dedication to preserving traditional healing knowledge and mentoring collaborative relationships that protected indigenous cultural heritage. The recognition represented unprecedented federal acknowledgement of traditional knowledge holders' contributions to American cultural preservation. 5 years had passed since Sarah Mitchell first crossed the boundaries of the Crow Reservation as an unauthorized researcher, and the transformation of both her life and the landscape around her had exceeded anything either she or Marcus could have imagined during their initial confrontation beside Crow Creek. The morning sun now illuminated a research campus that had grown from their collaborative partnership into a world-renowned center for indigenous knowledge preservation and environmental restoration. The Thunderheart Mitchell Institute for Traditional Ecological Knowledge occupied 100 acres of restored prairie land where Yellowstone Energy had once conducted their destructive extraction operations. The facility combined traditional architectural elements with cutting-edge research technology, creating spaces where tribal elders could work alongside international scientists to document and preserve indigenous knowledge systems that were helping address global environmental challenges. Sarah stood on the observation deck of the main research building, watching her 5-year-old daughter, Emma, chase butterflies through the medicinal plant gardens that Elder Pretty on top had designed. Using traditional cultivation methods, Emma's laughter carried across restored landscapes that now provided sanctuary for rare plant species while serving as living laboratories for studying relationships between indigenous knowledge and environmental sustainability. She has her father's warrior spirit, observed Dr. Running Wolf, the Blackfeet ethnobotanist who had become Sarah's closest collaborator in developing documentation protocols that respected tribal intellectual property rights while sharing knowledge that could benefit broader environmental protection efforts. But she also has the curiosity of a natural scientist. Emma Thunderheart Mitchell represented the future that her parents had worked to create, a generation that would inherit both traditional knowledge systems and modern scientific tools, equipped to address environmental challenges that required integration of indigenous wisdom and contemporary technology. Her bilingual education included both Crow language instruction and advanced science curriculum, preparing her to serve as a bridge between knowledge systems that had historically been kept separate. Marcus emerged from the Institute's law enforcement Training Center, where he had been conducting a session for tribal police officers from across North America. His position as director of the Federal Task Force on Indigenous Rights Violations had made him a recognized authority on protecting tribal sovereignty, but his heart remained anchored in the community where he had learned that individual strength was multiplied through collaborative partnership. The Canadian delegation wants to extend their visit, Marcus reported as he joined Sarah and Dr. Runningwolf on the observation deck. They're amazed by how quickly we've been able to restore the damaged ecosystems, using traditional knowledge combined with modern restoration techniques. The international recognition had brought delegations from indigenous communities worldwide to study the Crow Nation's model for protecting traditional knowledge, while engaging productively with mainstream institutions. The success had generated funding for similar projects on every continent, creating global networks for indigenous knowledge preservation that operated under community control. Elder Pretty on top, now in her 80s but still possessing the energy and wisdom that had made her one of the most respected traditional healers in North America, approached the group with the measured steps of someone who carried decades of cultural responsibility. Her recent recognition as a United Nations Indigenous Knowledge Ambassador had provided international platforms for sharing traditional ecological wisdom with global audiences. The plants are teaching us new lessons every day, the elder said, gesturing toward research plots where traditional cultivation methods were producing medicinal plants that had been thought extinct in the region. When we work with the natural world instead of against it, healing becomes possible in ways that surprise even those of us who have spent lifetimes learning from our plant teachers. Her statement reflected the philosophical foundation that had made the Institute's work internationally significant. Traditional indigenous knowledge systems approached environmental relationships as partnerships requiring reciprocity and respect. Concepts that mainstream environmental science was incorporating into restoration projects that had achieved unprecedented success rates. The afternoon brought the monthly community meeting where tribal members, institute researchers, and visiting scholars shared updates about ongoing projects while maintaining the democratic decision-making processes that ensured community control over traditional knowledge documentation and dissemination. Sarah's role as institute director required her to balance academic excellence with tribal sovereignty, ensuring that research achievements served indigenous communities rather than extracting knowledge for outside benefit. The medicinal plant restoration project has exceeded all projections, Sarah reported to the assembled community members. We've successfully re-established two species that were eliminated by industrial development, while documenting traditional cultivation techniques that tribal healers are using to train the next generation of indigenous medicine practitioners. The restoration success had attracted pharmaceutical companies seeking to develop commercial applications for traditional medicines, but the Institute's protocols required benefit-sharing agreements that prioritized tribal control over any commercial development. Several companies had invested millions in collaborative research projects that generated revenue for tribal communities while respecting indigenous intellectual property rights. Marcus's report focused on the law enforcement training programs that had produced certified tribal police officers serving reservations throughout the United States and Canada. The training curriculum combined federal law enforcement techniques with traditional justice methods, creating approaches to community safety that honored indigenous values while meeting contemporary legal requirements. We've trained over 400 tribal law enforcement officers in the past 2 years, Marcus announced. Crime rates on participating reservations have decreased significantly, while community satisfaction with police services has reached the highest levels ever recorded in federal surveys. The success had influenced federal policy beyond Indian country, with mainstream law enforcement agencies studying tribal justice methods to improve community relations in urban areas where traditional policing approaches had failed to build public trust. Marcus's expertise had made him a consultant for police departments throughout North America seeking to develop community-centered approaches to public safety. Emma's voice carried across the meeting area as she played with other children in the adjacent playground that had been designed using traditional principles that connected recreational activities to cultural education. The playground equipment told stories from tribal history while providing physical activities that developed skills children would need for adult roles in contemporary tribal society. "The children are our greatest achievement," Elder Pridian Top observed as she watched Emma and her friends navigate playground equipment that taught traditional games while encouraging physical fitness and cooperative problem-solving. They will inherit knowledge systems that previous generations feared might be lost forever. The evening celebration that followed the community meeting included traditional dancing, storytelling, and feasting that demonstrated how cultural preservation could adapt to contemporary circumstances without losing essential spiritual and social functions. Visitors from around the world experienced indigenous hospitality while learning about knowledge systems that offered solutions to environmental challenges that threatened human survival globally. Dr. Sinclair, the Maori researcher who had returned for her third annual visit, addressed the gathering about how the Crow Nation model was being adapted by indigenous communities in New Zealand, Australia, and Polynesia. Traditional ecological knowledge represents humanity's longest-running experiment in sustainable environmental relationships, she said. The Thunderheart Mitchell Institute has shown the world how indigenous wisdom can be preserved and shared while remaining under community control. As the celebration continued into the night, Marcus and Sarah found themselves walking along the river where they had first shared their feelings about building a future together. The landscape around them bore no resemblance to the industrial extraction site that had threatened traditional knowledge 5 years earlier. Native plants thrived in restored soil, while traditional fish runs had returned to waters that corporate contamination had once poisoned. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I had simply arrested you that first morning?" Marcus asked, remembering the confrontation that had started their partnership. "You would have become another academic researcher with a story about hostile tribal law enforcement, and I would have remained isolated in my fortress mentality." Sarah's answer reflected understanding of how individual choices could create ripple effects that influenced entire communities and institutions. "I think the Creator brought us together because the work we've accomplished required both of our skills and perspectives," she said. Traditional knowledge preservation needed someone who understood academic systems, while tribal sovereignty required someone who knew how to build partnerships without surrendering authority. Their relationship had become a model for collaboration that extended far beyond personal marriage to influence institutional relationships between indigenous communities and mainstream society. Universities, government agencies, and corporations were studying their partnership to develop ethical frameworks for engaging with traditional knowledge systems. Emma's sleepy voice called to them from the house where Dr. Runningwolf was reading bedtime stories that combined traditional tribal narratives with contemporary environmental science concepts. Her education was preparing her to inherit leadership roles in institutions that hadn't existed when her parents first met, but that would be essential for addressing environmental challenges that required integration of indigenous wisdom and modern technology. She'll grow up in a world where traditional knowledge is recognized as essential for human survival, Sarah observed. The barriers between indigenous and mainstream knowledge systems are dissolving as people recognize that environmental challenges require solutions that honor relationships between humans and the natural world. Marcus nodded, understanding that their daughter would face challenges they couldn't anticipate, but would inherit tools and partnerships that previous generations had created through persistence and collaboration. The warrior tradition teaches us that each generation must adapt to new threats while preserving what matters most, he said. Emma will learn to count coup on whatever enemies threaten her people's welfare, while building partnerships that serve the common good. As they prepared for sleep in their home that overlooked restored landscapes and thriving research facilities, Marcus and Sarah reflected on how individual relationships could contribute to institutional changes that protected cultural knowledge and environmental resources for future generations. Their partnership had demonstrated that love could serve purposes larger than personal satisfaction, creating legacies that honored ancestral wisdom while addressing contemporary challenges. The bedroom windows faced east toward the Little Bighorn battlefield, where Marcus's ancestors had achieved their greatest military victory through unity and strategic coordination. The historical parallel wasn't lost on either of them. Contemporary threats to tribal sovereignty and traditional knowledge required the same kind of collaborative resistance that had protected indigenous peoples for centuries. "I count coup on enemies who threaten our people's welfare," Marcus whispered as Sarah settled into sleep beside him. "But I surrender completely to partnerships that serve something larger than individual achievement." Sarah's response came softly. In the darkness, carrying commitment that had been tested through years of collaboration and crisis. "Traditional knowledge taught me that surrender and strength aren't opposites," she said. "The strongest people are those who can open their hearts to relationships that honor what came before while building what comes next." Their love story had become a preservation story, demonstrating how individual relationships could contribute to protecting cultural heritage and environmental resources that belong to all humanity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve the communities and knowledge systems that had brought them together. But tonight they rested in the peace that came from knowing their partnership had created lasting benefits for the generations who would inherit the world they were helping to heal. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.